Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derek, and with me today is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
Oh, you know what I realized as we set up the recording? I normally flip-flop our video spots and put myself on one side and you on the other, and today it's different. So
You're gonna be talking to yourself the whole time. You're gonna be
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
confused.
we're mixing it up.
You'll be sitting there thinking, "Man, this guy really knows what he's talking about."
There you go. Yeah. All right, so we are going to pause for a second for a single episode here in the biblical narrative and discuss something that I think is kind of an important idea here as we go forward. It's something maybe we should have discussed earlier, but we can discuss it now. It's kind of closely related to symbolism, which we talked about very early on, episode 8, maybe, I don't know, something like that. 7, 9, somewhere in that range. But yeah, the discussion of gender that we had in the last episode made me realize that this particular idea is probably worth talking about now. And that discussion clarified some things for me around how I would want to talk about this particular thing, and it'll also apply in the coming episodes. So today we're going to talk about the idea of patterns. I think that patterns are a useful way of thinking about things in the Bible, and actually I think all of life can be sort of understood by thinking about patterns. I think actually that's kind of what we do as humans, even though we don't always realize that's what we do. But from the earliest years of being a kid, you kind of learn via patterns. So that starts with the question of what do I mean by pattern? And that's kind of hard to nail down. But I was thinking an example might be worthwhile. All right. To sort of give kind of the gist of what I'm saying here when I say pattern. And we've already talked a fair bit about trees on this show. And they're perhaps one of the most useful elements of creation for all kinds of metaphors and examples. So I think we're gonna return to trees, actually, to discuss patterns.
Excellent.
And so to start here, I want to note that there is no universal definition of what makes something a tree. There's no like broad category of, well, this DNA component or this exact physical component is what makes something a tree.
Are you talking about like biologically, like
yeah,
or like okay,
so
like order
to,
and phylum and things like that?
Yeah. There's no like universal definition of exactly what, if we were to discover a plant, what would make us, what characteristics must it have for us to put it in the tree category. We don't actually have that definition.
Really?
It's not a widely agreed upon thing. Let's put it that way. There's several different ways of defining it out there. At the same time, though, there are some 60,000 species of plants which are generally referred to or considered to be trees, right? Okay. And that's because they are generally in keeping with the pattern of trees, right?
Yeah.
And how do we know that there is a pattern then for all these things? And the reason we know there's a pattern actually is because of the deviations from the pattern. All the trees deviate somewhat from the idea, the sort of perfect pattern of what it is to be a tree. And it's the species, the different species of tree come from these sort of subtle variations, as well as there's even further variation within each species as well. But think of it along those levels, I guess, that there is this idea of a tree, right? There's this pattern out there, tree. And, an oak is a variation on that pattern, and an elm is a variation upon that pattern, a cypress, and so on and so on.
Yeah. So we recognize trees by the fact that bushes exist would be a way of thinking about it, or the fact that other plant life exists that is not a tree?
Is not that. Yeah. Yeah, that's in part how we sort of recognize something. Is it fills in that kind of a gap there.
Okay. Interesting.
All right. And so just to throw in another metaphor to sort of bring this out, it's kind of akin to the idea of musical variation on a theme, right? And so we see this, I would say, more regularly in classical music and jazz music, more so than sort of your modern pop music. But that is the idea that there's a theme that exists in the music. It's a melody of sorts. And what happens is through the course of the music, the composer will vary that particular theme. So if you listen to it, you can hear, oh, that's sort of the same thing, but this time it was done a little bit differently, right? And that's what I'm getting to, I guess, with the trees. Is there that kind of a variation on that theme, on that main musical theme? Each kind of tree is a variation on that, if that makes sense.
This is very interesting because I think a big part of our testing of IQ is pattern recognition. This is something that we deem to be when you are excelling in intelligence as a human being, we test that by how well you are able to recognize a pattern,
right,
which is very interesting.
Yep.
And we tend to test. The musical example is very good because you tend to test the sophistication of a piece, especially with classical music or jazz music is a good example too, by how much they can deviate from the pattern while still maintaining the structure of a pattern.
Right.
That's a very common classical form is variations on a theme. And composers will do like 30 variations on a particular theme. And if you listen to it as a let's say novice listener, even advanced listener to classical music, you may lose the fact that there is still a theme in there.
Yes, we're about to get to that.
Study it closely, you can see that it's buried deep within the context of that. I would argue too, and I know you might disagree with me, pop music as well does do this. It maybe does it in a less, I'll say sophisticated, although I don't love that word, but sophisticated manner than classical music, because it varies the theme based on the arrangement and production. So you will have a chorus, which is a theme, but that's repeated 4 times throughout a song, and it's stripped down at times, and then it's fully backed up, and then it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's
that.
I get what you're saying. That works. Yeah, I was thinking just strictly musical notation, right? Composition. Yeah,
you're thinking harmonically, and so harmonically they vary it, and that's what classical music really emphasized. And same with jazz. Jazz tended to emphasize harmonic differentiation, and so that's where a solo over a theme is different, but it still maintains that structure.
Right.
So yeah. I think that ties in with the tree example. That's very good with the tree example too.
Yeah. Apologies. I thought I was hearing I am hearing a snowplow. I don't know why there's a snowplow out there working, given that we've had rain all day and there's nothing on the ground to plow. So
maybe you should go check to see if the driver's all right.
I think this is who is it? Adam Carolla always has rich man, poor man. So there's things that people in the middle don't do, but rich people do and poor people do. And this is what we call making sure you get a billable hour. Right? Like a lawyer who doesn't really have much to do, but needs a billable hour. And same thing here, right?
So both the snowplow guy and the
snowplow guy needs a billable hour too, right?
No matter what.
They're out there getting a billable hour, whether that work is really needed or not.
So. Yeah, no, good for him. Got to clear a little bit of the rain, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's what we got going on. So, all right. Speaking of patterns, there's a pattern for you, the billable hour pattern. All right, so
we're stuck in the middle.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so I want to return again to the pattern thing here real quick. There does come a point, right, in terms of this variation, when a pattern becomes so different that we might wonder whether it's the same pattern or not. And so if we go to trees, an example of this is in fact a palm tree, which, even though it has the name tree in its name, there's actually some debate whether a palm tree should be considered a tree or not. And the reason for this is it actually shares more in common in terms of DNA with the grass that is in your front yard than an oak. Really? Which is interesting. Yeah. It also lacks the secondary growth we typically see in trees. So, where you cut them down, you have the rings. That is the secondary growth of trees. Palm tree doesn't have rings. It doesn't have that secondary growth. So there is some debate on whether or not a palm tree is just sort of a very atypical presentation of a tree, or is it some kind of gargantuan grass that that is inhabiting the place. And so I guess my point here is that eventually the variation on the themes can get so foreign that it's hard to tell what the theme is anymore. But interesting or not, no one in this debate is suggesting that a palm tree should just be its own category. As far as I've been able to look in this debate, which is more than one human should, both sides seem to universally argue that it is in keeping with one of the patterns more or the other pattern. It is, one side says, no, it's definitely a tree, just very different. The others say, no, it's definitely a grass. It's just the largest one around.
So we have trouble. So we have trouble deviating from established patterns. We can't. We obsessively want to categorize something into something already existing.
Maybe, or is that the way we should think of it, though? Right?
Well,
because so here's what I'm going to get to. Right?
It's fundamental to our perception that we have to perceive things in keeping with a pattern.
I'm going to suggest it's deeper than that. I think it is fundamental to reality. Actually, is that there are these deeper patterns. I think that. Bringing it back to the Bible, we'll look at coming up here some of these deeper patterns that exist that can present themselves very, in very deviant fashion or very unexpected fashions, but those patterns are in fact there. They are just an incredible variation on it, right? Ultimately, I do believe it is true, right? It is either a highly varied pattern of a tree that almost looks like grass, or a highly varied pattern of grass that almost looks like a tree, right? It's one or the other.
Well, and it depends on how you define pattern. Then do you find define?
Well, here's what I'm getting to, right? For instance, you brought up musical themes, right? No matter how varied a composer might get upon a musical theme, and how foreign the sound they produce might eventually be, they still could be doing a variation on that original theme. They still could be starting from this central theme, and it could get so foreign that to most of us, it seems like, well, it's not though, right?
That's a different piece.
But if that's how the composer was putting it together, then it still is a variation on that theme, right? That's the key, is whether or not it is a part of that pattern or not would have to do with the creator of that pattern.
Yeah. And perhaps, and that's why sophistication is, we tend to view things as more, I think technically more sophisticated if they're able to vary farther away from that central theme, but still actually be attributing it to that central theme.
Right.
We tend to, and the people who can track with the creator who does that as being sophisticated consumers of it, let's say, and listeners in a more technical sense, not in a pretentious sense, but in a really technical sense of saying, look, they changed the time signature in the piece, they changed the key, they changed it from major to minor. It is way away from this initial theme, but you can still recognize the small bits of pattern that are connecting the two.
Yeah, and it can exist in other places too. For instance, people can relate, literature that most people might not see as the same.
Yes,
They can see patterns there.
Yeah.
Not to.
Well, and this is.
I'm not tooting my own horn in any way here, but I have an article. I'll try and remember to link it in this piece where I talk about the movie Godzilla versus Kong. And how some of the patterns actually in that film very closely reflect the patterns of the Bible, oddly enough. And if you can see that it's asking some of the same questions. It's a variation on the same thing. Ultimately, by the way, I think all stories actually are a variation on the Bible. since I see the Bible as the most complete form of all these patterns, but we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, you can see these sort of patterns in different, literature and stuff popping up as well. And you can relate things that might not appear to be related, but really they are variations on the same kind of theme.
Yeah, I think that's why we see so many references to common culture in literature. And for a long time, it was Greek mythology and Roman mythology,
Mm-hmm.
as using those gods as patterns or representations, or those stories as patterns and representations. It's like there's no obvious reason why we would need to do that,
right?
Or why writers would feel compelled to do that, except that
it's a good pattern.
And it's a more engaging because of that.
Right.
Because it's calling in other patterns, and we enjoy putting those pieces together and recognizing that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so when I talk about patterns here, basically I'm talking about sort of an idea of the order of things, right? And that for all things, there is sort of an ideal order, a pure pattern. And then there are things which are variations on that pattern. So if we bring this to the Bible, there's some patterns that are commonly familiar to people, right? And so, for instance, baptism is a varied pattern on that points us towards the pure pattern, the sort of completed pattern of the death and the resurrection. Mm-hmm. So it is a variation. It's not that same thing. But when we look at the pattern of baptism, we see in it very clearly the death and resurrection, right? We see that in that same pattern. Mm-hmm. And in effect, this is what kind of symbols are. Symbols are deviations on a pattern that point us towards that pure version of the pattern, right? Mm-hmm. And so
I would... if I can just push back just a sec on a very small thing.
No, yeah, go ahead.
I think a lot of times they're manifestations even more than deviations. Not manifestations, I guess, is in an older sense of the word manifestations. They're demonstrating the pattern in a more in a singular moment rather than in an abstracted concept.
Well, no, they are doing that as well, for sure.
And so while your manifestation of a pattern in your particular time and place might look different than that, it is a demonstration of it, of how it could be manifested in that particular time and place.
Yes. Makes sense. Yeah. No, but that to me is the variation, right? Then the time and place is the elements that have been varied, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The purest version of this pattern that I'm talking about is the actual death and resurrection of Christ in that singular moment, and that is, that is kind of an abstraction as well as a reality, right? Mm-hmm. But like that is that sort of purest version of that, and everything else is sort of a deviation on that. The things you're bringing up are one of the elements of deviation from that pure pattern.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's actually one of the most powerful messages of Christianity, is that pattern that is mostly abstract was manifested.
Yes.
I think that's what's really powerful about it, is that's why you're being called to manifest it yourself as well, because it was manifested by God as well.
Right.
It wasn't just abstracted by him, and wasn't just presented as, here's an abstract pattern of what you're supposed to do. It's like, no, I'm going to demonstrate exactly how it would be done in an actual time and place. That's a really, I don't think any other faith even, I don't think many attempt to do that. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I don't think many attempt to really do that in a perfect sense.
Not in the same way. Yeah.
Buddhism is the only one that I would say the Buddha attempted to achieve enlightenment and supposedly achieved enlightenment and then came back. Right. So that may be the closest thing that rhymes to that. But none really seem to say that this was perfection manifested properly.
Yes.
In a actual time and place. Yeah.
Well, and then going from that idea too, we can go to things that are more abstract, right? And that is the Lord's Supper, right? The Lord's Supper is sort of a varied pattern that points to the pure pattern, which is largely just spiritual, not physical, but the pure pattern of incorporating Christ into our very being, right? And the idea of partaking in the Lord's Supper, consuming, Christ in this sort of symbolic sense here, that is, similar to our sort of consuming Christ and letting him incorporate into us in a spiritual sense, right? So that's another variation on a pattern. Another one is, and we'll get to these soon here, probably after we discuss the full sort of Garden of Eden narrative. But there are patterns between the temple and Eden, and then the ultimate pattern of that being the kingdom of heaven, right? That being sort of the purest version of that pattern. And then throughout the Bible, we see the what I would call the purest of all patterns, the place in which all patterns sort of find the completest version of themselves, and that is Christ, right? And we see that throughout the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, right? We see imperfect versions of the pattern of Christ in David and Adam and Noah and Moses and Joseph, Abraham, Ruth, Esther, perhaps everyone in the Old Testament, right? I think we all, being made in the image of God, are an imperfect pattern of Christ, right? And he is the completed, purest, fullest version of that pattern. So hopefully what we're going to do is look at the Old Testament. I think a lot of people, they see the oaks, right, of the Old Testament and say tree, all those names we mentioned. But one of the things I hope we can do as we move forward here is find the palm trees as well, right? Those things which don't seem to perfectly, or don't seem to even be very close to the pattern of Christ, and maybe look at it and say, yeah, but this too is actually in the pattern of Christ. An example of that would be Cain, right? Cain, who we don't think of in the pattern of Christ because he killed Abel. He would seem to be the opposite. But he says, am I my brother's keeper, right? And in a way, it's like, well, yeah, you were meant to be, right? And so he's in that pattern. He's just so deviated from it that he ends up doing almost the opposite of it. But Christ is the purest version of being his brother's keeper in a way. So that's one of the things I think we're going to do with that. And then also, by the way, the pattern of Christ and appreciating that persists beyond the Old Testament. Particularly in Protestantism, we have this attitude of like, well, we only see Christ in the Old Testament. We don't see him so much in people past then, but they really do, right? You see this more easily in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, where you see the idea of saints, right? Saints are a celebration of people who embodied the pattern of Christ, right? Not perfectly, and that is understood, although perhaps not as understood as it should be. I would say they go a little too far when they go to praying to them and those kind of things. But let's put it this way. I think they go too far in maybe celebrating the individual and not celebrating the fact that we as humans have the ability to participate in the pattern, all of that, right? They don't do that enough. But
I think there's a utility.
Okay, yeah.
There's a utility. I think there's a utility to the
yes,
to the particular manifestations that oftentimes saints, if you look closely enough, they tend to represent a particular experience that someone is having.
Yes,
and
a particular part of Christ's pattern.
Of Christ's pattern, exactly.
Yeah.
And so in the fully
abstracted,
exactly. In the fully, I mean, Christ is a. That's why it's weird, because he is a particular manifestation, but he feels almost abstracted, which is why you even have these debates early in the church about the physical reality and why it's so important that they land on there is a physical reality, because they're saying, no, it is a particular manifestation, but it feels so abstracted because it's so broad as this is the perfect pattern that you can
Yeah.
possibly emulate. For an individual, that doesn't lose utility, but there could be some utility to focusing in on a particular expression of that pattern, and that's what a saint tends to represent. You know, the one who comes to mind is Francis of Assisi being the saint of poverty, and so this recognition that is a crucial part of the pattern, and so people turn to these particular aspects. And I know you could then coyly just say like, well, those you focus on the entire pattern, and it's like, yeah, you should, but is that practical? Are people actually capable of doing that?
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
exactly, at all times.
Yeah, it's sort of like, well, by looking at bits of the pattern, you then can actually better see the full pattern. Almost,
exactly.
You know, by examining parts, you can better understand the whole.
Exactly. And so the humans themselves who came to represent this, I think for most Catholics, it's not, well, I would hope for most Catholics, I guess, it's not a worship of the individual as much as it is a recognition of the thing that they've come to represent long after they're dead at this point.
Yeah, which I think is all good and fair. I think, again, to me, it's you go to sort of the prayer part of it, and then it's a little too far, you know.
Yeah,
that's what it is for me. But
yeah, and it certainly could be.
All right, but so that the saint is the Catholic version, but I also want to point out that Protestants, without naming it, kind of do the same thing. I've witnessed this quite a bit. For instance, one of the examples I use would be in the Baptist circles. Charles Spurgeon is, for all intents and purposes, a saint. in their realm. I once saw someone on Twitter who posted something like, wherever I agree with Charles Spurgeon, I'm right, and wherever I disagree with him, I'm wrong. He's right. Yeah. You know, and it's like, okay, you're going a little bit far, and they probably would admit they're going a little far if you talk to them about it, but it still felt like, that's a, it's a weird thing to say. And in part, I think there's actually a problem that the Protestants have gone too far in the other direction, so much that they've come all the way around to the same place in a way, right? They sort of run from the idea of saints, but then create their own saints without naming it. And in a way, isn't that, kind of every bit as dangerous? Like be aware of what you're doing, be conscious of it, discuss it, talk about why we do it, right?
Maybe it's even an inevitability.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. I think it is an inevitability.
Look at the first 500 years of the Catholic. Look at the first 500 years of Orthodoxy. I mean, it's not evident that, maybe my history isn't perfect, but it's not. Saints aren't immediately adopted. And it's taken. We're at 500 years of. We're at 500 years of Protestantism as we know it, and we're at 2,000 years of let's say 1,900 years, or you want to go from the Council of Nicaea, 1,700 years of Catholicism. So Catholicism has a lot longer, and Orthodoxy has a lot longer stretch to it. And I think there might be even a difference in saying, maybe there is, but the idea that a lot of the saints, or many of the saints of Orthodoxy and Catholic Church, are dead, and there's nobody alive who would have even known them.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And so there's this,
although they name them saints sometimes much quicker than that.
They do, absolutely, and that might be an issue. But there's this tendency within Protestantism. Yeah, I think the unnamed saints thing is very common.
Yeah, look at C.S. Lewis to be doing this thing, but not sort of admitting that that's what you're doing. I think actually that is every bit as dangerous as what's gone on and who knows, in the Catholic Church, if you will.
Maybe in 500 years that happens in Protestantism.
And maybe so. I'm just calling it out now. I'm saying Protestants, maybe if you're going to do this thing, let's sort of fess up to it and kind of admit that, that's kind of what we're doing. It's not, and then maybe try and figure out, okay, now that we know we're doing the same thing, now you can sort of guard against doing what the Catholics did in terms of going too far. Right. Mm-hmm. You sort of threw it out altogether, but I think it's now emerged that it's like, no, it's kind of, you can't get rid of it. Like we need to celebrate those who adopted certain parts of the pattern of Christ so well, at least in our understanding of it. Like that's something humans sort of have to do as a means of encouragement, right? Because it sort of lets us see that we too could, definitely adopt these parts of the pattern. It's been done before, it's a thing we can make happen or move more closely aligned with the
things
pattern
to
of Christ.
aspire to be.
Yeah, in ways that sometimes it's easier to aspire towards than Christ specifically, because we know we will ultimately fail at that one. But then when we see people who have had at least, let's say, more success in being Christ-like than ourselves, at least in these specific areas of life, then that's good to have out there, at least as a thing that you can sort of aim at. And so you're still aiming at Christ, but you're doing it kind of through another path, which frankly, when I look at the way people treat John Calvin or Spurgeon or, many of these
C.S.
other
Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, I guess, for sort of your I don't know, stereotypical evangelical, that's who they would maybe point to. But yeah, when you see the way these people are talked about, and there is sort of an aspiring to be these individuals, it's like, okay, well, maybe we need to name what's going on, and then find that place that is sort of the happy medium between the Catholic, actual praying to the saint and all the way and attempting to abandon it altogether, because you can't do that either.
Well, we hit this weird territory. I mean, I even think of how many Calvinists I know whose dogs are named Piper.
No,
after John Piper.
Yep.
It's shocking that the amount, and it's like there is a sainting of him almost while still living.
Oh, the same is true in the Baptist for this fella Albert Mohler, who is, I don't know, president or something of the Southern Baptist Seminary, something or other. But yeah, the way they talk about him, it's like, to me, honestly, it's the way they talk about it is like creepy. Like, it's like, he's still a man. Like, he's still a dude. Like, I'm sure he has a life littered with sins. And the way they talk about him, it's let's just say it's more veneration than I would be comfortable giving to a human being, living or dead. But it's a thing that's going on, that's for sure.
Correct.
So yeah, I don't know. It's but I think Protestantism at least needs to sort of come to grips with the fact that this is a thing you're doing now. So you may as well sort of name it and figure out your guidelines on how you're going to continue forward with this thing. This sort of Protestant sainthood of sorts.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So lastly, to wrap up the idea of patterns, patterns are sort of a spiritual thing. I want to make sort of that clear, is that so we have all these trees in existence. I don't think we have the perfect pattern of a tree, right? Maybe that is the tree of life, right? And in the Garden of Eden, maybe that's what that is. But we don't have that perfect pattern of a tree to see. So it's sort of it's a thing that spiritually is out there. And it's a thing that I think we recognize. And so when we look at trees, we realize, oh, that's a shadow of that thing, or a variation on that thing that I can't describe that's out there. But because these patterns are spiritual, it's hard to describe with words, right? They are something we can sort of recognize and identify, but they're sort of beyond our capacity to fully define. We may be able to gather a few characteristics and sort of describe those things. And that's useful up until a point when you reach palm trees. Those things that are so varied from the pattern that it's hard to nail down whether they align with it or not. And I'm sure if we really fully understood the pure pattern of trees and grass, then we would be able to look at the palm and say, well, you are a tree or you are grass. It seems humanity has defaulted to tree, what with the name palm tree, as grass-like.
Grass.
Yeah, as grass-like as it may be, we seem to have settled on tree more or less collectively, given the name. But or it could be a thing like the killer whale, right? The killer whale is in fact a member of the dolphin family. It's not a whale at all. So there's that too. So but given this sort of unknowability of patterns or undefinability of patterns, that makes a text like the Bible so important to us, right? Because the Bible kind of reveals to us some of the most major patterns that are out there, right? I mean, this is what the Ten Commandments in a way are. They're just a revealing of, hey, here are some patterns to avoid, right? Have no other God before God. Don't commit murder, right? Well, what is murder? Well, not every killing is murder, right? Murder is, it's not thou shalt not kill, it's thou shalt not, commit murder, basically. And that's interesting. What is the difference between a murder and a killing? It's like, well, that's a difference in patterns. That's not a difference in let's put it this way, the material facts, they never fully give us an answer to that, right? We can get this context and we can get what's going on and all that, but there's always these edge cases. And that's why we developed this sort of a jury system where a set of people look at it and try to decide that's a murder, or that was a justified killing, right? But we have these things that are sort of on the edge where we don't know, whether it is that or not. If you look at George Floyd, right? And the cop, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but what he did there, no one disputes that he is at least, involved in the death of George Floyd. Let's put it that way, right? Mm-hmm. No one's going to argue that. Clearly, he has some sort of a role to play in that. Whether it is a murder or not, well, that's sort of this, does it fit the pattern of murder, or does it fit the pattern of something else? Manslaughter, justified killing, police use, what is it? And so that's sort of where the jury comes in, because it is not a material thing, that pattern.
Yeah, and
it can be manifested materially, but it's a spiritual thing, that pattern.
The extreme cases that are on the edge are the ones that really prove the importance of being able to recognize patterns and not recognize, because right. we have
palm trees.
Two qualifications. The palm trees being on the edge of being like, does this still match the pattern, or does it completely switch over to a new pattern?
Right.
That's on the edge, but then the extreme case of being extreme repercussions for being on one side or the other. So the murder example is a very good one, because if it falls into the pattern of murder, there is a deep, there's a certain punishment. Whereas if it falls under, let's say, the George Floyd case wouldn't fall into this, but you can see conceivably where you would have a self-defense argument for killing. And so when you're looking
protection of someone else, right? There was
murder or protection of someone else.
There was the cop who shot that girl, who initially the internet wanted to. I think LeBron even tweeted his picture and said, "You're next" or whatever. And then the footage comes out, and it's
LeBron does that to everybody.
But no, of course he does. But the footage came out, and he saved another girl's life. I mean, she was swinging a knife at another girl, and if that had connected, could very easily have killed her. And so he what he was doing was actually saving someone else's life, right? So that's the other end of the spectrum, as you were saying,
So we end up in a situation where it's on the edge, where you're saying, okay, does this murder, is this let's say justified killing or something to that effect? And you're on the edge case, and also if you go one direction or the other, it is an extreme repercussion or an extreme difference in repercussions that really brings to the forefront. Because there's things where it's like, well, palm tree and whether a palm tree is a tree or not doesn't make that much of a difference. But whether someone goes away to prison for life,
maybe it matters. When we're terraforming Mars, all right. When we're terraforming Mars, I want front lawns of palm trees because they're grass. That's clearly that's what matters, right?
And at that point, we're going to be so tall that we're not even going to recognize.
Right, exactly. We'll be good to go.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, it could have some significance, absolutely.
Maybe, yeah, but yes, obviously in those situations, there's a greater impact,
Yeah.
But yeah, so as we go forward through some of these verses and whatnot, and the Bible as a whole, I think we're going to try and highlight some of these different kind of patterns, because I think the Bible reveals all sorts of patterns to us. In fact, we've kind of been talking about them without naming them as such, especially when we went through Genesis 1 and talked about sort of the different elements of order that God has established within the universe. Those are patterns that exist within the universe. So now we have a name to call them, something to refer to them by. So we'll be doing that as we continue on with the show. Speaking of which, next time we're getting back in Genesis. We're going to look at Genesis 2:22. So be sure to join us then. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, follow us on Rumble, share with friends. Check all the show notes and everything. We'll have an email landing page or whatever to sign up for our mailing list down there. Hopefully we'll have some regular worthwhile content coming out from there. We're not going to load up your inbox. Definitely nothing more than once a week. I'm not planning on. I can't.
We're subscribing you to all the spam.
Yeah, right.
Kidding. We're not going to. We have a list of companies to sell it to.
Oh, no, that's the worst. I hate that stuff. Be sure to do that though. Sign up and tell a friend, and we'll see you next time.